thank the organisers of the conference for giving me this opportunity to speak to you. It's a privilege and I look forward to it. And I'd like to send my greetings to all the attendees and wish you a successful conference. The West does not understand China. It doesn't understand China because the West's self-belief is that every country should be like the West. The same norms, the same values, the same kind of institutions. But it's quite impossible for China to be like the West. Why? Because China comes from very different history and a very different culture. And it is these two things that shape China today and, of course, over a long period of time. Now, let me give you a classic example of the West's problem in this context. You will remember that between 1972 and 2016, there was a relatively cooperative and benign period in the relationship between China and the United States. And for the Americans, this was based on two basic assumptions. The first was that over time, as China modernized, it would westernize, and thereby it will become increasingly like a Western-style country, maybe economically, but certainly politically. It didn't happen. The reason why Trump pulled out of the China agreement, as it were, was because of this extraordinary miscalculation on the part of the United States, which was a product of Western hubris and Western arrogance. Because what happened was, by Jove, China certainly modernized successfully, reaching a level which challenged the position of the United States in the world economically. And at the same time, it certainly didn't become like a Western-style democracy. China's political system remained as distinctive as it had been at the beginning and as distinctive as it has been historically over a very long period of time. And here we have the crunch. China will remain highly distinctive from the West in all sorts of different ways, because China is rooted in Chinese civilization. It is a civilization state as well as a nation state, but primarily a civilization state. It is shaped today, as well as historically, by Confucian values. The relationship between the state and society is very different from that which prevails in the West. And of course, meritocracy is a fundamental aspect of Chinese governance. Now, nowhere is this chasm, if you like, between China and the West more evident than in their respective political systems. Let me talk about the West's attitude for the moment. The West thinks the West's main calling card, put it like this, main calling card since 1945 has been democracy, by which it means universal suffrage, multi-party system, rule of law. And in its view, any political system that does not have these characteristics lacks a fundamental legitimacy. In other words, that in its view, China's political system lacked popular legitimacy. The West believes that this is the summit of achievement when it comes to governance. It cannot be improved upon. It is, if you like, here to stay forever. Now, a bit of history here will help us to get this into context, because we need to get it into context. We're talking about since 1945. Between 1918 and 1939, most of what we know as the West was not democratic. Britain, yeah, at that period, conformed to this. The United States, by and large, conformed to this. But by and large, across Europe, for example, most countries were not democratic in this form. Indeed, many were authoritarian regimes. So it's very important to get this into context, you see. Because if we want to understand what's happened since the 1945, we don't want to deal in abstract ideals. We want to understand the circumstances that underpinned the West's ability and commitment to this kind of democracy. This period was marked by Western hegemony, Western leadership of the world, Western economic supremacy in the world, reasonable economic growth, and of course, rising living standards. These all pertained in the West, certainly from 1945 to around about 1980. Then from 1980, things began to weaken, to fall apart a little, if you like. Because, you know, since 1980, half the American population has had either stagnant or falling living standards. And the financial crisis in 2008 accelerated the growing economic problems in the West. Growing dissatisfaction, which had political implications, political consequences. It is impossible to understand the election of Trump in 2016 without understanding the deep dissatisfaction amongst wide sections of the American population in the American system, its failure to deliver, the failure of the democratic system to deliver, not just the economy. Now, we saw this reach extraordinary proportions just before the presidential election, January the 6th. Insurrection, Capitol Hill, Washington, D.C. The citadel of democracy, as it were, in the American way of thinking. And we saw increasingly, well, maybe does Trump actually support American-style democracy? Is he an advocate of it? Well, there wasn't much evidence to suggest this. He was clearly, at best, a profound skeptic. So what we are witnessing in the West is a crisis of democracy, a growing crisis of democracy, certainly in the United States. Biden's in power now. Will Trump get elected next time, or will someone like Trump get elected next time? We are witnessing in the West a crisis of governance. Now, the West likes to talk about some kind of crisis of Chinese governance. I'll come to that in a moment. This is obviously, quite frankly, nonsense. In fact, what the task the West has to address is this. They don't understand the Chinese Communist Party. And they need to understand the Chinese Communist Party, because the Chinese Communist Party is undoubtedly the most formidable political party in the world. It is the most successful political party of modern times. It has transformed China since 1949 from an extremely poor country to what is now the second largest economy in the world, and increasingly it's on the verge of becoming the largest economy in the world. This is a remarkable achievement. And you might ask the question, well, how is the Chinese Communist Party succeeded in doing this? This is an extremely important question. I think that first, it's, as I've already alluded to, it's got extremely deep roots in the Chinese population. And that's given it a sense of the need to represent, of representativity, and also an underlying self-confidence that you do actually represent the people and therefore can act and speak on their behalf. That's one factor. I think the other factor I would emphasize is that the Chinese Communist Party is intellectually remarkably agile, resourceful. It has a sense of direction, or an ability to conceive of a strategy and follow that strategy through. There's another characteristic I think that's worth emphasizing about the Chinese Communist Party, and that is it combines two things which on the face of it are dichotomous. One is it thinks long term. It's very far-sighted. It is always thinking about the future. It's always conceiving of what the future, what China's future should be like, on the one hand. And on the other hand, it's very pragmatic. Remember the old slogan, very popular with Mao, but also many Chinese leaders, Deng and Xi Jinping and so on. Seek truth from facts. In other words, don't build castles in the air. Always make sure that you're addressing the reality as it is. So you have these two very powerful steers, if you like. One is long-term thinking. The other is being pragmatic, always keeping in touch with the situation and where the people are. Now, what's another very important characteristic, it seems to me, of China and Chinese governance? And here we reach back actually into Chinese history. You know, one of the features of Western discussion of the state of governance is that by and large, it only talks about the means of selection. In other words, about how they conceive of Western style democracy. The points I made earlier, universal suffrage, multi-party system, and so on. The West does not, or barely ever actually in reality, talk about state competence, government competence. Now, when you take China, China is entirely different. And this goes back a very long time. In fact, in some sense, it takes us actually back to Confucius. China has always prided itself on its statecraft, on its governing competence. This has always been regarded by the Chinese as absolutely fundamental. That the state is it contains and is composed of the best people, and it is able to act in a highly competent way. And I would underline this point and this difference, because in the reality, although China's still, you know, a developing country and come very quickly from poverty and so on, and has never had these kind of resources before, but actually state competence, the competence of those who run the state, is much higher than it is in the West. And if you want to understand how China has got to where it is now, then this is one of the very most important reasons. Now, one of the criticisms of China in the West is that it is that it's a one-party system, and in a one-party system, the people don't have any choice, and therefore it's subject to a process of ossification. Well, first of all, it would be difficult to claim that the Chinese governance, the Chinese system, or China itself has ossified in the period since 1949. I mean, this is a country which, figuratively speaking, has been changing at the speed of light and has managed somehow or other, with an extraordinary way, to keep pace with the way in which the society and the economy has changed and remained in the leadership of that process. So what about choice? Well, let's not talk in cliches here. Let's take the end of Mao, after the death of Mao, and Deng Xiaoping becoming China's leader. And what did Deng Xiaoping represent? I mean, he believed that China was changing, was growing, but could grow faster. He believed that China could do much better. So what did he do? He made two fundamental changes to the way in which the Chinese Communist Party thought. First of all, he expanded the notion of economic strategy to embrace not just the government or the state and the plan, but also the market. This was a big change, but it was an absolutely critical change, because from that moment, China, instead of growing at around 4 to 5%, started growing at 10%. And secondly, he believed that China needed to join the world, to integrate itself with the world, including the capitalist world. He was very confident. Ultimately, we have to be able to compete with the capitalist world. In other words, he was behind the integration of China into the world. Now, these were actually two profound changes, bigger changes than any major Western countries made in that same period between 1978 and the present. Extraordinary changes. And where did they come from? Another political party? No, it came from the Chinese Communist Party. How does the Chinese Communist Party manage to do something like that? Because this is a Communist Party deeply rooted amongst the people, very self-confident, and therefore able to make changes which, quite frankly, in a Western country like the Democrats and the Republicans, or the Conservative Party and the Labour Party, we've never seen anything like that. So the idea that just because you've got a one-party state, you ossify, you can't make shifts, you can't make changes, you lose touch with the people, I'm sorry. That might be happening in the West, but it's certainly not been happening in China. And by the way, the other thing, of course, that Deng made was he introduced, he said, look, we need a new kind of state. We need a state that is competent to engage in economic transformation. We need a new mentality. We need everyone to possess this idea of where we need to go. We need everyone to have initiative and so on. And Deng, I think, was in a sense, he in that sense invented the modern Chinese innovative spirit that we see now so well. So what else can we say about it? Well, one of the things that always strikes me and impresses me about the Chinese Communist Party is that it doesn't think that despite all these successes, despite this extraordinary history, it doesn't believe that it is a model for others. It doesn't expect, it doesn't require, it doesn't believe that other countries can transplant the Chinese way into their own country, because China is specific. China is very different. Now, contrast that, by the way, with the attitude of the United States, as I started at the beginning. Everyone should be like us. Everyone should have a Western template. Or contrast it indeed with the Soviet Communist Party, which believed, in every country being like the Soviet Union. China's mentality is very different. Sure, it's got things to offer. It's got things that other countries can learn from, especially the developing world, but also increasingly the developed world. But that's different from requiring other countries to copy you. And I think that's very important. China, in that sense, understands historically and in the contemporary context the fundamental importance of pluralism, of plurality, of diversity in the world. And that is what it informs in my view, this approach. So what can we say? Well, in conclusion, I'd make 2 points. First of all, we're celebrating the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party. Does it seem old? Does it seem as if it's lost its energy? Does it seem as if it's getting stale? I think not. I think actually the Chinese Communist Party is extraordinarily dynamic institution, which has this incorrigible ability to keep moving with the times. And I expect it to do in future. Now, of course, the future will be a huge challenge, because China's future will be as a much more developed and prosperous country, society and economy, and also playing a much more important role in the world. Do I think China will be up to the challenge? Well, of course, China will make many mistakes. It's always making many mistakes. Any leadership that doesn't make mistakes is not a leadership, because it's not doing anything. You have to experiment. You have to find out. You have to work out. You have to move on. You have to learn, not just from your successes. You must learn from your mistakes. And this will be the challenge for the Chinese Communist Party, for example, over the next 50 years. In conclusion, I just want to say this. Let's reflect, to finish, on China's history. Over a period of 2,000 years, since the Qin dynasty, 211 BC, China has uniquely had arguably 5 periods when it has been either the most advanced society in the world or one of the most advanced. I'm thinking of part of the Han, the Tang, maybe the Song, part of the Ming, and part of the Qing. And now China stands on the eve of once more becoming the most developed and most important country in the world. And it will have achieved this under the remarkable leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. Thank you very much.